There is a perception among people who play D&D that Fireball is the most potent spell in the game. After all, it's a big, fiery explosion that's about the best damage you can get at that level of spell over a large area. And obviously, a lot of damage helps you finish a fight faster. The issue with this perception is that it's nonsense. Not only are some of the assumptions I just stated wrong, I would like to try and convince you today that Fireball is not only not as good as a load of people think, but that the use cases of Fireball are so niche and so improbable that I think it is unlikely for it to come up in a realistic in-world spell selection by most mages. Even when said mages are planning on dungeoneering or heading into battle, I genuinely do not think Fireball is a good enough spell. So strap in for perhaps the most controversial video I will ever make, why Fireball actually really sucks. To make this argument, we all need to be on the same page as to what Fireball can and can't do. It's a third level spell that, when cast as an action, allows a streak of flame to fly between the caster and a point they choose in space. A point in a straight, undisturbed line within 150 feet of the caster. When it arrives, this streak of flame becomes a fiery explosion, dealing fire damage to every creature within a 20-foot radius sphere. This damage being halved if they succeed on a dexterity saving throw. The spell also ignites flammable objects within its area that currently aren't being worn or carried. That is an accurate description of what the 2024 version of Fireball actually does. So first things first, Fireball isn't an actual physical explosion. It has no blowback effect, it deals no force damage, and deals 0 damage to any object or structure in the area, unless it is specifically an object that is being set on fire, which has its own version of damage, which is usually 1d6 per round. Functionally, reading just the spell's text itself, it is only creatures that can be damaged by this spell, meaning that a wall of stone, or a sheet of lead, or any sort of physical barrier completely blocks this spell's fiery explosion. Long-time D&D aficionados may be upset with me here, saying, Fireball actually spreads around corners, filling the sphere that it's in, so any flimsy blockade isn't really going to cut it. Hiding round a corner is useless actually against Fireball, that's why it's so good, except that doesn't exist anymore in the 2024 rules. A magical effect of a sphere, as defined in those newest Dungeons & Dragons rules, is an area of effect that extends outwards from a single point of origin, outwards in all directions. This area of effect then can be blocked by anything that both provides total cover and is a physical impediment to the spell's area of effect. 2014's Fireball had a special bit of text which said the fire spreads around corners, which helped avoid this particular rules case, but the 2024 version, the current version of Fireball, doesn't have any special effect other than following the sphere magical area of effect. So this is a spell that can only harm creatures, as per the spell's text. It can only harm creatures and set flammable objects that are not being held or carried on fire. And it doesn't so much explode as make a sphere of fire magically appear in a very limited area, not blocked by walls or other physical obstructions. It's niche, in a word. And yet Fireball is considered among the most desirable and potent spells by so many for one single reason. It deals 8d6 worth of damage to any creature within the area on a failed save for a third level spell slot. Big boom, big damage, everyone's happy. That is also misleading. Sure, if you use a gridded system and put an enemy in each potential square that can be affected by Fireball, that's at least 44 potential victims. Notwithstanding the ability to use the sphere's verticality to stuff even more targets into one spot. But scenarios are few and far between where you get 10 enemies within such a radius, especially if you're also avoiding fireballing your allies. The best chance you have of dealing any significant damage using Fireball would be as some sort of countermeasure to a tight-knit formation like a shield wall or the Roman tortoiseshell or Tetsudo formation. Although I would wager that any sort of closed ranks, densely packed formation like this would be vulnerable to any area of effect spell, really, even area of effect spells that are cheaper than Fireball itself. Largely, to destroy such a formation, all you need to do is destroy one part of it, then the whole thing can't really hold together anymore, and has an exploitable vulnerability that can be exploited by other troops. There is a further issue with Fireball, militarily, or even in a dungeoneering context, which is linked to its fairly impressive damage. 8d6, or an average of 28 points of fire damage, is quite an awkward number. On a failed save, yes, it is enough to take out any creature of CR1 or lower that isn't resistant or immune to fire damage and isn't the brown bear. You can one-shot any common thug, warhorse, goblin, lizardfolk, or commoner, although some of these you are needing them to fail the dexterity saving throw, which is one of the most common saving throws for creatures to be good at. There is no doubt in my mind that Fireball will thin the herd and clear out any weak enemies in an area, and it will also likely do a significant chunk of damage to tougher enemies too, like the CR3 Knight, who on average loses more than half his health to a Fireball. But that's all he loses. Hit points. The tragedy of D&D's combat system is that hit points are not an important consideration at all unless the number you have is 0, or you're specifically being targeted by a power word spell. A creature can fight well until its hit points are exhausted. That is the general rule. However you personally feel about this, or however you rationalise it, via hit points being a measure of toughness, glancing blows being in effect until you take the fatal one, or hit points as a measurement of your willingness to keep fighting, this is the material reality of Dungeons and Dragons. If something is damaged and not downed, it is just as scary and capable. If we're getting even more into the technical nitty-gritty, we should look at the notion that although the total damage spread by Fireball across 5 different enemies is pretty solid in a broad sum, a single target spell that can reliably take one of these creatures out of the fight would be a far better use of your time, action economy-wise. What tends to make other area of effect spells worth casting in this game is not usually the damage they deal, but their secondary effects. An extreme example, perhaps, but Hypnotic Pattern does no damage at all. But if its targets fail a wisdom saving throw, they are charmed, have a movement speed of 0, and can take no actions, can't speak, and they also immediately break concentration on any concentrated on spell. This remains true, by the way, for a minute, or until they take damage or are shaken out of their stupor by someone's trying to help them. Functionally, this is almost like being reduced to 0 hit points. You can't do anything for the combat for a minute, which is longer than most engagements in small-scale skirmishes, and certainly long enough to open up a hole in a defensive line in a broad military engagement. Against nearly every enemy with more than 14 hit points, which is the average damage that Fireball does when it's saved against successfully, Hypnotic Pattern will have a greater effect on average, even if half of your victims succeed. Because then, even if they spend their next turn snapping their allies out of your spell, every person targeted then wastes an entire round's worth of actions. Now, I'm not the first person to suggest that blasting and doing a bunch of damage isn't optimal for most mages most of the time in this game. This fact is no secret to D&D's optimization community, especially Treant Monk, whose optimized wizard has been a fantastic resource, and it still remains to be one today. But what I want to stress here is that Fireball is not only weak because it exerts less battlefield control than other spells, but that it is weak because it is actively worse than other damaging spells. We need to talk about shapes. Using a sphere to target a group of people standing on the ground wastes an awful lot of the potential space that you are gaining by having a spell shaped like a sphere. It's likely that you're never getting to use the full 20-foot radius of the sphere in at least one of its main dimensions. unless you're dealing with some heavily grouped up flying enemies or enemies in water, in which case they take half damage from fire anyway. If our primary concern is largest possible area on a single plane, spheres are not our best option. You may think our best option is a cube, as that at least fills in the entire gridded section of an area. But technically the biggest bang for your buck comes from D&D's oddest spell shape, the cone. Most people don't think about this too much because it's weird, but cones, technically, the way they're described in D&D, have a diameter at their widest point at the end of them, which is equal in fact, to the length of the cone. Cone of Cold, the archetypal cone-based spell in this game, for example, it's a 60-foot cone, meaning that at 60 feet away from the caster, it creates a 30-foot radius circle of effect. So if the caster positions themselves 60 feet above their target, then the area of effect of a Cone of Cold is significantly more useful and larger than the sphere created by Fireball. And it's also possible to hit any flying or not grounded creature within that distance of 60 feet between the caster and the floor as well. If we're getting properly geometric with it, you can also technically manipulate the conic intersection with the flat plane of the floor to make even large and differently shaped areas, elliptical areas. This is in a world where mages have unlocked a very high level of geometric sensibility, and it does feel a bit cheap, so we're not going to be discussing that any further. So, Cone of Cold is bigger, does more damage, and targets a constitution save, which is slightly better than a dexterity save, but it is a 5th level spell compared to Fireball's 3rd level, so it's not really equivalent. Plus, you also need to be within 60 feet of your target, and perhaps also flying above them, which then puts the mage, the caster, in far greater danger. It is not clearly better in every situation, but for mass damage across a large area, it is better in most. But I'd like to actually finish this video by looking at Fireball's strengths, where it is good at what it does, and trying to demonstrate to you with spells of Fireball's level or lower, that these strengths are not just also present elsewhere, but are generally surpassed by most other spells in its orbit. No more 5th level spells getting discussed as comparisons here. We'll begin with range. Fireball has a 150-foot range, with the potential for the affected area to be up to 170 feet away, which puts the far end outside the longbow's short range. This is brilliant. It means you can blast archers with damage without them finding it easy to shoot you. The trouble is, Hunger of Hadar has the exact same range and the same extra area of effect distance, while also being the same size as Fireball, creating difficult terrain inside it, and blinding all creatures inside and obstructing the views of any creature outside of the interior area and beyond. It deals guaranteed cold damage every single turn, 2d6 of them with no save, and has acid damage, again 2d6 extra, tied to a dexterity save, at the end of their turn for every single creature inside. If we say, on average, while finding their way out, creatures will spend 2 turns starting their turn inside it for 4d6 cold damage, and 2d6 acid depending on a dex save, that is roughly equitable, frankly, to Fireball's 8d6 fire damage, which is halved on a successful dex save to 4d6, and gets halved again whenever it is resisted, and ignored completely if immunities to fire are in play. Fire is the most resisted damage type in the game. In every way, Hunger of Hadar is a better spell than Fireball, excepting the fact that you need to be a warlock to cast it. We've already discussed Hypnotic Pattern, but it's worth stressing again. This spell is the same level as Fireball, and it really is strictly better than it. For weak minions, Fireball is often overkill, and for stronger enemies you would prefer to ruin their action economy or apply a condition. And Hypnotic Pattern's conditions are about as good as they can be, unless the enemy is immune to being charmed, in which case it's a bad spell. Equally, if they're immune to fire damage, Fireball's a bad spell. Add in the massive extra boon of Hypnotic Pattern breaking concentration if you fail your save against it, and it's clear where the chips fall in terms of a general utility AoE spell. But at least Fireball is the best spell of its level in clearing out weaker minions en masse, right? Surely if a bunch of 10 HP guys are standing in a big clump against the better judgment of all strategy and tactics, Fireball is the best option. Not really. Conjure Barrage, or Rhyme's Binding Ice, would probably do the trick. The former a 60-foot diameter cone, and the latter a 30-foot diameter cone that can freeze enemies momentarily in place. Now I am aware that Hunger of Hadar and Conjure Barrage are not on the spell lists of wizards and sorcerers normally, and that oftentimes class-specific spells are more potent than the baseline. But I have seen players use, especially the Lore Bard's magical secrets, to select Fireball. It is honestly nuts how overestimated this spell is in the D&D playing community. But I will say, even if you're just limited to the sorcerer spell list, you will almost always find that a non-fireball spell is more versatile, is better at disabling enemies outside very specific health ranges, and generally has more utility at more levels of play than Fireball does. Which Fireball, I will remind you, does very little damage in water. It uses the most resisted damage type in all of Dungeons & Dragons. Targets one of the strongest saves across player characters and non-player characters alike. Doesn't do damage to any object or structure except setting certain objects on fire in very specific situations. And it doesn't even spread around corners anymore. In all honesty and sincerity, I genuinely believe 2024's Sleet Storm is a better spell than Fireball. It affects a larger area. It creates heavy obscurement, meaning you won't get shot by the people in it. Douses flames, creates difficult terrain, and forces a save every single turn to avoid being knocked prone, and also losing concentration on any spell that may be held. Knocking prone, by the way, even affects flying creatures, which can even deal some damage. It makes any creature caught inside the Sleet Storm functionally fairly useless for, on average, a couple of rounds, giving a far greater strategic advantage than one big boom. Stop prostrating yourself at the altar of Fireball and make better choices, more interesting choices. Please. I hope you enjoyed that, maybe learned something about how Fireball operates, or some other spells that might be of some creative use. I mean, also, something I didn't mention there, if you're looking for alerted damage, there are better spells than Fireball as well. Spirit Guardians springs to mind. Or Conjure Woodland Beings, or whatever that one is in the new rules that's very similar, that does a massive AoE and an emanation around you. Emanations are also fairly abusable with larger size characters as well. If you'd like to see more like this, do subscribe, get in the comments, tell me why I'm wrong about Fireball. Please try and defend it if you can. But I hope I've been fairly comprehensive about why this spell is just not as good as we tend to think. Just our basic assumptions sometimes need investigating and examining, and that's what I try to do on this channel. So if you have enjoyed, feel free to subscribe, check out some of my other videos where I do exactly this and delve into the assumptions that we make about the worlds that we create in fantasy that don't quite ring true, and try and tease some of those things out. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.